The Nadezhda Incident. Written by No Name Registered. After the death of my grandmother a few years ago, my family and I had the ability to go through her and my grandfather's estate and save what we wanted before the junk was auctioned off. It is important to note that my grandfather worked for NASA throughout most of the 1980s and 1990s. I managed to find several boxes and a couple of filing cabinets in the attic filled with old papers and tapes taken by my grandfather during his time at NASA. Many of these papers were boring and uninteresting, as you might expect from a video engineer. But a few of them are very interesting and even shocking. I've released a couple of these articles onto the web previously with marginal success. Nothing has happened to me so far, so I'll continue to release them at a slow pace. The following is a transcript of an old VHS tape I found labeled Nadezhda in my grandfather's squiggly handwriting. Now, for clarity. This conversation is between Jeffrey Therens, a recently returned astronaut from the International Space Station, and a representative of an organization called the Somnus Contingency Committee, who is conducting the interview. For conciseness, they'll be referred to as GT and INT. The interview takes place in what appears to be a file storage room. There are rows of tan folders on the shelves, a few loose papers on the floor, a single folding chair, plenty of outdated, dingy fluorescent lighting. It gives the room a slightly yellowish hue. A man walks in from off-screen and sits down in a chair facing slightly off-camera to the left. He's haggard and looks tired. His NASA shirt and khakis were clean-pressed, but they gave off the appearance of being the only thing that was holding him upright. His shaggy, blondish hair was flopping onto his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot. At first glance, he looked like a person who hadn't slept for days. After sitting down, the man gave a tired, almost defeated-sounding cough and moved his gaze to the floor. In the lower left-hand corner of the screen, there's a label that reads, Houston, Texas, September 2nd, 1995, 2:16 p.m. INT says, "Please state your name and what your role was aboard the ISS over the period of June 15th, 1995 and August 4th, 1995. GT says, "My name is Jeffrey Therens. I was the leading U.S. research scientist aboard the ISS. My field of study was to determine the effects of zero gravity on simple organisms and their viability for long-term space travel." "Very good, Mr. Therens," INT says. "We have called you here today to shed some light on the so-called Nadezhda Incident. This conversation is off the official record. Your non-disclosure agreement is not affected. I've already spoken to Carolyn Huntoon and George Abbey. They've both agreed to look the other way. This is for the Somnus Contingency Committee's eyes only." At this, Jeffrey briefly looks at the camera and then back at the floor in the direction of the interviewer. He says, "Whatever, I just want to get this on tape before I croak too, huh?" There's an awkward silence of about 10 to 15 seconds here as Jeffrey continues to stare at the floor. The interviewer continues, "If you could, in your own time, can you please explain what happened in the Nadezhda module aboard the ISS? GT says, "There was a contamination event in the module and it had to be jettisoned into space. It was determined by Carolyn Huntoon and the head of the Russian Space Committee that the best course of action, in order to prevent further contamination, was to remove Nadezhda entirely. What was the contamination of the Nadezhda module? It has been officially called an air seal malfunction. The interviewer says. There's a silence. Jeffrey just continued staring at the floor, and his breathing became more ragged. Mr. Therens, if you don't want to talk about it, we can... Jeffrey interrupts him. I don't know. Some fungus. It was all over him. You couldn't even see the floor anymore. He watched us through the glass. He couldn't even move anymore. But he watched us do it. Mr. Therens, we don't have to go over this. The interviewer interrupts. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I don't know how much time is left. I don't know if I even have an option anymore. If it weren't for those upstairs, I might have actually had a chance to... Jeffrey suddenly breaks off and begins to cough a dry, dusty cough that lasts for a few seconds. When he resumes talking, his voice has dropped in pitch and he sounds defeated. Let's just get this over with. I need to sleep. My throat is killing me. What fungus were you referring to? The Russians were studying the effects of radiation on crops, as I recall, the interviewer asked. They were. But they were also studying this new fungus that they found growing in Chernobyl. Most likely radiotropic fungus, if you care. Per Artem, this stuff was actually able to eat excess radiation and use that to sustain or supplement itself. Or something like that. He was primarily studying the effects of unfiltered solar radiation on samples taken from different locations around the incident site to see if the radiation in space had the same effect on the fungus. He finished and looked at the ground. Artem, the interviewer asked. Jeffrey sighed a heavy sigh, which was followed by another long, dry coughing fit. Artem Ferdova, the lead scientist and professional botanist of the Russian group. The fungus was his pet project. I remember he called them his baby atomic mushrooms. Overall, Artem was a bit aloof, but easy to get along with. His English wasn't as good as Ivan's, though, so I spent less time with him. Elijah and him got along better. You should really be talking to him. He was more involved. Yes, Mr. Scott was unable to be interviewed. It's our hope to interview him in the future to hear his side of the story as well. What can you tell me about the fungus other than what you've already said so far? Not a whole bunch. It looked kind of like branches of tiny black mushrooms. They filled the petri dishes that he brought. Actually, from a distance, they kind of looked like a black carpet in the bottom of the petri dish. They were probably... Jeffrey breaks off here, like he's reliving a memory. Mr. Therens, the interviewer asks. Oh, yeah, sorry. They were probably only a centimeter or so in height, and they smelled like an old mushroom to me. That's one of the things that I'll never forget. The smell of that room when we found him. It should have smelled so much worse, but it only smelled like, well, like a cream of mushroom soup that was going bad. Anyway, there wasn't anything particularly interesting about them that I can remember. A lot of my memories are kind of blurred together now. I haven't exactly been sleeping particularly well since we got back. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, the interviewer said. Did you notice anything different about Artem in the days leading up to the incident? Gregory coughs some more, then says, Not particularly. He was always pretty quiet and kept to himself. I would say that he got more quiet and aloof than usual, but he always said he was close to a breakthrough. If I remember right, he had a cough too, so none of us really complained that he was busier than usual. We didn't want to get sick either, but... Jeffrey looks up at the interviewer here, smiles dejectedly, and coughs again. Here we are, he says. The interviewer looks away and asks, It's my understanding that Ivan Pornarov also survived the incident. Is that correct? Yeah, Ivan's here somewhere. Last I heard, he was in sickbay too. He took the whole thing pretty hard. I think him and Artem went a ways back. Can you describe the events leading up to your discovery of the incident in the Nadezhda module? Take your time and please recount all the details you can. Here, Jeffrey appears to have gained some of his composure back at this point. He shifted slightly upwards in his seat, cleared his throat, coughed decisively, and began. It was probably a couple of weeks before anyone began to notice any changes in Artem. Over the course of that third week, Artem began to skip meals with the group occasionally, and he spent longer hours in his botany lab. He claimed that he kept getting distracted. He was also sick on and off. He attributed it to not enough sleep and poor nutrition. Artem claimed he was getting close to a breakthrough, so neither Elijah or myself saw much of him in the weeks leading up to the incident. I do remember that he continually mentioned how well his atomic mushrooms were progressing. He went on for several minutes one rare night over dinner about how he believed that the radiation-eating properties of the fungus were actually acclimating to the solar radiation instead of the nuclear radiation that they had experienced in Chernobyl. Per his calculations, Artem believed that in a couple of days his sample sizes would be large enough to start cross-pollinating and selectively breeding his fungus samples to be specialized for solar radiation. He began to become more and more observed in his work. The rare times that anyone would see him outside of his lab, he seemed distant and bored. Most of those final conversations, he mostly stared off into space and gave dejected, almost apathetic answers. His chronic illness from lack of sleep and not eating enough was only getting worse. He had visibly lost weight and his voice was quiet and raspy. He also smelled and his clothes were dingy. When he did pay attention, he seemed almost manic. Needless to say, Elijah and myself were a little put off. But Ivan reassured us that Artem was deeply invested in his project, and with its rapid progression, his obsession was bleeding through slightly. Neither myself nor Eli really liked that answer, but it really wasn't our place to say anything. I did my best to ignore the whole issue, and for a while, life settled into a routine. I nearly forgot about the unsettling presence that was Artem and his obsession. It was really Ivan that all... Here, the interview interrupted him. I'm sorry, but so, this was over a couple of weeks. From what we were able to gather from Ivan's audio logs, he made it all sound like this happened suddenly. Here, Jeffrey sends a slightly irritated look off camera to the left.
That's what I was about to say. It was really Ivan.
Here, Jeffrey's voice breaks and he goes into a massive coughing fit. At the end of it, he wipes his mouth dejectedly, looks at his hand and grimaces. Then he wipes it on his navy blue NASA polo shirt.
Can I get some water? All this talking is killing my throat,
he says. A voice says something from off camera, and Jeffrey gets up slowly and shambles off screen. He returns a moment later, holding an Aquafina water bottle, and takes a slow swallow.
As I was saying, it was really Ivan who noticed that there was a problem. He came to us slightly panicked, saying that he hadn't seen Artem for a few days. Ivan was pretty sure that Artem wasn't leaving the lab at all anymore, and that sometime over the last few days he had put some sort of cover over the windows to keep us from looking in. Ivan kept trying to get back into the lab, but Artem seemed to have blocked off the door somehow. Needless to say, we were all pretty worried, and we decided to try to force the doors open. When we got to the lab, we all tried yelling and knocking on the door with no success, no answer at all. After pushing for a while with no success, we finally bum-rushed the door in an effort to shake the barricade loose. It didn't work as well as we had hoped, but we finally did get some more progress.
Here, Jeffrey takes another slow sip of his water and tries to stifle a cough to no avail.
I'll never forget the sound that door made when it finally opened. It made a ripping noise, kind of like a real thick, wet newspaper. Once it began to tear open, the doors flew apart and the three of us went sprawling onto the floor.
Here, Jeffrey's eyes go blank and his voice fades out. His left knee begins to bounce slightly after a few seconds. The interviewer looks at him concerned.
Mr. Therens, are you okay? We can pick this up later if you need time to.
Jeffrey interrupts him.
You weren't effing there, okay? You didn't see Artem. You didn't see the...
Jeffrey's breathing begins to get ragged and the bouncing of his knees stops and is replaced by him clenching and unclenching his hands.
Mr. Therens, I think we can pick this up another time,
the interviewer says. Jeffrey glares at him and says,
No, you made me relive this hell. You can be sure I'm only going to do it once. Besides...
He begins coughing again. This time the sound is wetter and it looks more painful. He finishes the water bottle and sighs painfully before continuing.
The lab was dark and cloudy. Everything, the walls and desks and even the lab equipment was covered with a black carpet. Artem was nowhere that we could see. Lights were useless in the mess. The entire space of the lab was cloudy with what seemed like a fine gray dust that hung in the air, and the light diffused into a useless blob. After getting accustomed to the obscure lighting, we were finally able to make out a sense of the layout of the lab. Everything was where it normally was. It all seemed to be covered with that black carpet. The atomic mushrooms. I was in the back trying to determine where the growth started from. I heard Eli make a strangled noise and fall over, knocking stools and lab equipment to the ground. He vomited on the floor and himself, and then he ran out of the lab. Ivan, as concerned as I was, ran after him. swirling that gray dust around the room as both him and Eli ran out the door. I tried to run after them, but as I started, Artem's foot moved and tripped me too, and I fell into the central workspace.
Here, Jeffrey coughs again. It sounds even worse than the last time. He wipes his hand on his shirt again and grimaces.
Growing into the wall by the original mushroom samples, there was his vague body-shaped form sitting in the floor against the wall. His feet were splayed out into the room and his hands were limp at his sides. His mouth was wide open, but filled entirely with mushrooms that spilled out onto his chest and ran down to his legs. The only movement at all was his eyes. They were bloodshot and held open by a couple of small mushrooms that kept them from closing all the way. He was looking frantically around the room and at me and towards the door, and he was crying.
The interviewer interrupts him and says,
This wasn't what Ivan said in the logs. He said...
Jeffrey interrupts.
Ivan never saw Artem. He ran out before Artem woke up. But Artem was alive. I don't know how, but he was. I could see him trying to move under the mass of mushrooms that held him to the lab floor. As he moved, or tried to, the little tops of the mushrooms began to open and close. As they did, even more of the gray dust was released into the air, and it obscured Artem briefly in a thick gray cloud. As the cloud cleared, Artem's spore-filled eyes looked directly into my eyes, and I felt a connection with him. I could feel his hopelessness and his urgency through his eyes. Artem looked directly at the door and refused to look at me or anywhere else. So I took his hint and I left. What? You left him there? He was alive?
The interviewer exclaims. Jeffrey stands up abruptly. His head and shoulders disappear out of frame.
Yes, I left him there. He was doomed. He wasn't even breathing, for God's sake. He knew how doomed he was. He was growing into the wall.
Here, Jeffrey gives another choking cough.
We took him out of there. He definitely would have died. Why do you think he was staring at the door? We had to.
Here, Jeffrey chokes, gives a very wet cough, then vomits a black slimy mess onto the floor and his khakis. He then attempts to sit back down on the chair, but misses and ends up rolling backwards onto the floor where he vomits again.
What the?
The interviewer exclaims, and the video ends. In the same box as the VHS tape, there was a small folded piece of paper, also labeled Nadezhda. On the inside of the paper, there was a brief epilogue to the interview conducted on the tape. It read, Jeffrey Theron's, Elijah Scott, and Ivan Pornarov entered a Level 5 quarantine beginning on September 4th, 1995. Jeffrey Theron's condition deteriorated further shortly after the interview. He sat in a catatonic state for 46 hours after the end of the interview, and he ceased breathing due to the amount of radiotrophic mushrooms growing in his mouth and throat. Despite not being able to breathe, Mr. Theron's vital signs continued to be faint but stable, as the fungi continued to take hold of his body. They began to be transported in his bloodstream and poked through his skin in random locations. Throughout this entire process, Mr. Therens appeared to be in minor discomfort and vaguely aware of his surroundings. He finally passed away in his sleep on April 23, 1997. His cause of death was determined to be a lack of local radiation for the mushroom colony which was supporting his vital organs to feed on. His death happened shortly after he was relocated to a different containment facility without access to sunlight. Dr. Ivan Pornarov passed away at nearly the same time during a similar transference of facility. But Elijah Scott, as well as the film crew and interview team, remain alive at the time of writing this. They are similarly supported by the mushroom systems within their bloodstreams, but appear to be in reasonable health otherwise. Further updates to follow. May Somnus sleep until the nightmare is over. Signed, GWS AB, July 18th, 1998. Anyway, for those who are interested, the last findings I released from my grandfather's NASA collection can be found here. I still plan to continue to release interesting findings slowly over the next few months, provided nothing happens to me. As always, if you don't hear from me after a long time, you can assume the worst. It's been a pleasure, guys. Until next time, hopefully. No name registered.